Yo, Shalom. SUC in the building. SUC in the building. Source Gang in the building. 7 Gang over everything. Y'all know how we rocking, man. You know how we rocking, man. We back, full effect. Back whenever moving backwards. Here to put Israel on the atlas. Y'all know the slogan. We say no to vague interpretation and give thorough breakdowns. It ain't a doctrine I can't take down. Had to do that one time for the one time. I can't spit one rhyme without a punchline. And with that regard, I go hard in the yard with a library card. Those are bars. Let's go. All right, so, man, without no further ado, we're going to open up with my brother LV Europa, man. Shout out to that brother. He just went to Cali, shot a new video. You know what I'm saying? Hopefully we can debut it on the channel. You know, we show him all the love and respect on the planet, man. Dope artists, support him. LV Europa TV on YouTube and Facebook. Please support him. Tonight we will be covering the Black Jews in Africa and the Americas, chapter 6. All right, so let's get it. Let's go.
Europa TV. Log in, tap in. Yeah, they got it bumping. I woke up with a particular vibe. I'm at a crossroad with a message in disguise. There's a change on the horizon. You'll get it when you climb. It's a level to a level. Many levels in the mind. Transform into a state that's optimal and prime. Engaging interference intervenes with your incline. Divided and divine divides the scheme to the pride with the creator gate of all. Many fall with that shine just to be a future light for the lost and the blind. If I had to look back, my impact is on time. In a world where they don't know I is not myself and I know why. We headed to the world but we don't go by falsehood. Lies from old mixed with the new shit. Debauchery, evil that no one know what to do with. Who's stopping me? My focus is still on monogamy. Dedicated on one task, still love is a monopoly. This the way it is, not the way that it gotta be. Europa Report TV, man. Stop playing. I went to bed with a particular feeling. The cops stopped patrolling. The hood stopped drilling. Mamas didn't lose their daughters. Fathers still love their children. Respect at the forefront for all of us building. Principles of reinstate what never was, but always willing. With a force so compelling, you can tell by the healing. No heat that comprehends the shape of my tetrahedron. I was breathing different life. I told my wife I'm in the season. What the greatest shall return, even the best to look decent. It's far beyond time, even the older look recent. And the newer look newer. And you should've looked sooner. There's a seed in your spirit, never mind a late bloomer. I was steady in the trap with the looters and intruders, bust maneuvers, puffing hookah till I fell in the manure. So my own stripes away just to pay the connoisseurs. My death creates life in the depths of the sewer. Catch an Uber with the Ruger, kept me safe with my medulla. Hallelujah to my daddy, but only my mama knew ya. But I still love you the same, and you know I'm coming through ya. You're a diamond in the ring of life, praise to the jeweler. Yeah. Make sure you check us out on Facebook and YouTube. Check us out, Europa Report TV, LV Europa, Airtime TV.
Yo. Yep, man. Show our brother some love. LV Europa TV on YouTube and Facebook. You can go find and support that man's channel, his music, his work, and his talent. It's just a godsend, you know what I'm saying? So, you know, shout out to everybody. He get much love over here at the source. We're going to salute you, King. All right, but we're here for the Black Jews in Africa and the Americas. The Black Jews in Africa and the Americas by Tudor Parfitt. You understand? Tudor Parfitt. We're on chapter 6, and we're going to be dealing with the emergence of Black Jews in the Americas. Very pertinent chapter, very pertinent history if anybody's claiming the Israelite lineage in today's what we call America. You understand? So it's good to know about Cherry, Rabbi Whitworth, so on and so forth, and others that played a part, even Marcus Garvey, that played a part in consolidating this thing that we call Black Israelism, is what some people may title it. You know what I'm saying? Shout out to Perry Hay, man. Yeah, man. Yeah, man. That was LV Europa, man. LV Europa. He keeps providing us with fire, man. Constant fire. All right, man. Before we get into the broadcast, before we get into actually reading, before we open up and read any copywritten information, we always do this. We read the Fair Use Act, let you guys know that we're well within our right to cover this information. Section 107 of the Copyright Act provides the statutory framework for determining whether something is a fair use and identifies certain types of uses, such as criticism, commentary, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. We're going to be doing a mixture of all of that. We're going to be doing teaching, scholarship, and research. We are using this for scholarship and research purposes, and the people will be getting taught tonight. There will be some critiques and there will be commentary that I will be adding to Dr. Parfitt's work tonight as I see fit. So we're well within our right under the Fair Use Act, Section 107 of the Copyright Act. All right. All right. With no further ado, man, before we get into the meat and potatoes of this, man, I just want to give a few shout outs. Shout out to the CEO, Jeremiah. Please say the Yah, put some respect on his name. Shout out to Tanks on the Ground, General Yashar, you know what I'm saying? And shout out to Diamond, you know what I'm saying, working at the stores. She putting in that work, man. And shout out to James, man, swinging and banging all the way from Atlanta, Canaan, down there in Houston. My brother James Cassell. Shout out to D-Red, the blue collar scholar. You know what I'm saying? He putting in work in the background. You know what I'm saying? That's really our ambassador for the source. Shout out to King Self, the middleweight champion. Gold Coast Gorillas. Let's get it. And shout out to all the fam. Plumantis, I see you, man. Shout out to Plumantis coming on every live and showing love and respect. Hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel. Y'all know how we do. You know how I'm rocking, man. Let's get it. Let's get it. Hey, shalom, Surya. Shalom. I'm glad you put the T as silent in your name because I was trying to pronounce that the other day. All right, man, let's get right into it. Let's just get right into it, man. We're gonna continue where we left off, and deal with chapter 6. All right, so share screen. Hey, shalom to everybody that just came in the room. All right, you should be able to see my screen now. All right. There we go. All right, so the Black Jews in Africa and the Americas by Tudor Parfitt, chapter 6, the emergence of the Black Jews in the United States. It says, when Christopher Columbus, 1451 to 1506, set off on his 1492 voyage, he took with him as interpreter a certain Luis de Torres, died around 1493, who was a recently converted Jew, and as it turned out, the first person of Jewish origin to settle and die in the Americas. De Torres was something of a linguist, and apart from Spanish, Greek, and German and Portuguese, he also knew more exotic languages, including Aramaic. The idea was that his Oriental languages would enable him to speak to the natives of the land on the other side of the Atlantic. On Friday, November 2nd, 1492, Columbus decided to send Luis de Torres, who, as he says, understood Hebrew and Chaldean and even some Arabic, with a landing party just in case they encountered any Hebrew, Aramaic, or Arabic speakers. Columbus may well have had Eastern Jewish traders in mind, but given that he had attentively read Mandeville's travels, it is more likely that he was thinking of the lost tribes of Israel, who are widely thought to inhabit the eastern portions of the great Asian landmass. So real quick, and we're going to get back into the reading. So obviously he was carrying these Jews that understood these languages because of what the author just said. I mean, I'm going to recapitulate it, that he was expecting to find some Hebrews or lost tribes of Israel, because that was a theme going on in medieval time. We read earlier that that's what was being echoed. Where did the lost tribes of Israel go? And he felt that he would run into them while selling what he thought was east. Well, he sold west and discovered the Indies, quote unquote, over discovered. But back into the reading, it says, for hundreds of years after the arrival of Columbus, the most frequently involved or invoked explanation for the origin of the indigenous population of the American continents, North and South, was that they were lost tribes of Israel. The Spanish embraced this theory with enthusiasm, according to the historian and missionary Juan de Torquemada, 1562 to 1624. It was Bartolome de las Casas, 1484-1566, the so-called apostle to the Indies, who first proposed that the South American population was descended from the lost tribes. According to the Irish lost tribes enthusiast Edward King, Viscount Kingsborough, 1795-1837, the celebrated Lost Casas entertained no doubt that the continent of America had in early ages been colonized by the Jews, and he even goes so far as to say that the language of the island of San Domingo was corrupt Hebrew. In his Historia General de las Indias, 1553, Francisco Lopez de Gomara, 1511-1564, noted of the native population in South America. They are all very like Jews in appearance and voice, or they have large noses and speak through their throat. The Indians, according to Torquemada, too, were literally of Israelite stock, biologically Jews, and had been persuaded by the devil to worship him in South America in a similar manner to their worship of God in ancient Israel. Moreover, it soon became axiomatic that most, if not all, local languages were dialects of Hebrew and other Jewish languages. What was true of South and Central America was also true of the North. Major General Daniel Gookin, 1612-1687, a settler in Massachusetts who was appointed captain of the military company in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1644, undertook a thorough study of the indigenous population. He started his great work, Historical Collections of the Indians of New England, in 1674, with a chapter on the origins of the Indians. The predominant conjecture about their origins, he pointed out, was that this people are of the race of the 10 tribes of Israel, as many learned men think. Later English colonists, such as Quaker William Penn, 1644-1718, found all manners of signs of Judaism among the Indians. After his first few months, Penn noted of the Native Americans, their eyes little and black, not unlike straight-looked Jew. Their language is lofty, yet narrow, but like the Hebrew in signification. Like shorthand in writing, one word serveth in the place of three. For their origin, I am ready to believe them of the Jewish race. I mean of the stock of the 10 tribes, and that for the following reasons. First, they were to go to a land not planted or known, which is to be sure Asia and Africa were, if not Europe. And he that attended that extraordinary judgment upon them might make the passage not uneasy to them, as it is not impossible in itself from the easternmost parts of Asia to the westernmost parts of America. In the next place, I find them like the continents and their children of so lively resemblance that a man would think himself in Duke's Place or Bury Street in London, where he seeth them. But this is not all. They agree in rites. They reckon by moons. They offer their first fruits. They have kind of Feast of Tabernacles. They are said to lay their altar upon 12 stones. Their mourning a year, customs of women with many things that do not now occur. So, end quote. So, a lot of these authors and a lot of these people in times past was seeing these similitudes amongst the native Indian tribes, and that's what's being recapitulated in Tudor Parfitt's work. Let's keep reading. It says, very many sources from the 17th century through to the 20th suggesting the Jewish origins of the North American Indians could be cited. The Israelite trope was active during the 19th century, first in Great Britain and parts of Europe, and then in the United States in the creation of a new racialized religious identity, not only for distant others like Indigenous Americans, but also for white Anglo-Saxons and Celts and other Europeans. British Israelism and its American counterpart, which became both influential and numerically important by the end of the 19th century, and which still had a significant following, perceived the white population of British Isles in the United States as being quite literally and biologically descended from the lost tribes of Israel. So as you can see, before we read on in 63 and 64, you have various lost tribe models, lost tribe theories on who these people could be. You have the Native Indian theory, you had the British or Breton theory, and so on and so forth. All right, let's continue to read. In some versions of this ideology, actual Jews were regarded as imposters. This freshly minted pedigree, which was underpinned by comprehensive biblical exegesis as well as by the undeniable success of Anglo-Saxons' recent history, contributed to the notions of white supremacy and imperial entitlement, which legitimized the supreme role of Great Britain and later the United States in the domination of the world. Man, that's a lot. That's a lot. That's a lot in a paragraph, saying that these pretty much that a lot of these themes were used and contributed to the notions of white supremacy and imperial entitlement, right? And it says, and it legitimized the supreme role of Great Britain in the United States in the domination of the world. The reading on Anglo-Israelite ideology was developed by John Wilson, 1799-1870, who used scientific racialism and Christian phrenology in his quest to establish the role and mission of Great Britain in the world through the spectrum of the lost tribes of Israel. His successor, Edward Hine, 1825-1891, perhaps the most influential proponent of Anglo-Israelism, continued the elaboration of this new racial and religious identity for the peoples of the British Isles. His convictions enabled him to contemplate the extinction of colonized people with composure. We have literally fulfilled Israel's mission by pushing the Aborigines of our colonies to the end of what was once their own country, as we require more room, so we do push and drive them into corners. This we have done to the Caffres, the Maoris, the Bushmen of Australia. All our Aborigines are positively dying out gradually but surely before us. For Hine, the extinction of non-Israelite lesser breeds was proof of the destiny of Anglo-Saxons to be heirs to the promises of the Bible. Scriptures were widely mobilized in the support of various theories of race and ethnic origin, and Anglo-Israelism in many ways was one of the movements that most radically pillaged the scriptures for the purpose of creating a new racial identity for its adherents. In so doing it, redrew some of the central categories of 19th century racial discourse. So basically, he's going into the imperial entitlement and the white supremacy even more, and how British Israelism was trying to use that to justify the taking of Aboriginals' land. Because if you're looking at yourself as Israel, then the next thing is, okay, where's our conquest of Canaan? So they're looking at everything as a conquest of Canaan, or the native populations are like the Canaanites and we the Israelites, and it's pretty much manifest destiny that we take it. So that's what he's covering right now. That's the history that he's bringing out. It says, thus it was that in America, from the very first interaction between colonists and native populations throughout the long centuries of the transatlantic slave trade and right unto modern times. Lost tribes theories regarding Native Americans or Anglo-Saxons in the United States, sundry others in Central and South America, and countless groups throughout the world, including Africa, were swirling around, generating books, articles, religions, and even government policy. As time went on, a number of groups in the United States came under the spell of the lost tribes. Native Americans, Anglo-Israelites, some early Pentecostalists, many blacks, and Mormons all vied for this illustrious pedigree. Unlike the colonial situation in Africa, where white missionaries in most colonies were eager to nominate some Africans as lost tribes, American whites most emphatically did not consider promoting American blacks as Israelites. I want you guys to really hone in on that part. They didn't really welcome this idea, is what Parfitt is telling you. That's one of the groups they did not welcome. American whites most emphatically did not consider promoting American blacks as Israelites. There was indeed little eagerness to promote them even as Christians. There was usually a pious desire to convert Native Americans to Christianity, but distinct reluctance to convert African slaves unless it was to introduce them to the story of Noah and Ham in order to make them more submissive. One reason for this is that the Indians were known to be descended from lost tribes, and according to the millenarian beliefs, their conversion could usher in the second coming of Christ. No such cosmic event would accompany the conversion of black slaves. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, lost tribes ideas circulated in newspapers, pamphlets, and books were spread from the pulpits of American churches and no doubt reached black audiences at first or second hand. In 1836, for instance, Joseph Wolff, a famous Jewish convert to Christianity and an ardent missionary, himself no stranger to the lost tribes issue, went to the United States, where he preached in Philadelphia, Washington, and Baltimore. He remarked that the idea that the American Indians were of the lost tribes had lately been so much mooted. Worthy people in America desired me to travel about with them in order that I might convince the Indians of their extraction from the Jews. I came across the Mohican tribe near New York and asked them, "Whose descendants are you?" They replied, "We are of Israel." I asked, "Who told you so?" And expected to learn much ancient tradition. To my great surprise, they said Mr. and Mrs. Simons of Scotland. In general, so again, they was learning this from outsiders, is what he was trying to point out. Reading on, in general, blacks, as we have seen, were situated outside the lost tribes discourse. Blacks were ignored by American whites in their construction of lost tribes identities, not least because the position was already filled. Some lost tribes ideas and Anglo-Israelite guise, however, fed into the emergence of Pentecostalism, which would eventually have a powerful impact upon the blacks of America, particularly through the teaching of Charles Fox Parham, 1873 to 1929, who led the Great Revival in Topeka, Kansas in 1901, one of the key moments in the development of the Pentecostal movement. Parham was an Anglo-Israelite and held deeply racist views. He was particularly opposed to the woeful intermarriages of races begun by Cain, who he thought had bred with some dark pre-Adamic race. In this, he was supported by W.F. Carruthers, a lawyer who worked alongside him in the early Pentecostal movement in Topeka. Carruthers argued that throughout that history of the world, races had never mixed, and it was the fault of slavery that in the United States, blacks and whites had been forced in recent times into a promiscuous and unfortunate proximity. However, the Holy Spirit had come to rescue by creating, particularly in whites, a deep sense of racial revulsion, which had the effect of keeping blacks and whites apart. Racial bigotry was not at all the work of the devil, as some claim, but the working out of the divine will. In 1903, the Pentecostal, and this is very interesting. I'm going to get back to the reading. This is very interesting. A lot of our, especially because I'm from the South, a lot of our people come from a Pentecostal background. And we don't even know that the Pentecostal background has racism and racist overtones that it deals with. And this foundation. You know, he just brought out that racial bigotry was not seen as the work of the devil, but the working out of the divine will in the eyes of the Pentecostalists. So that, you know, that's something to note. That's something to note. All right, let's keep reading. In 1903, the Pentecostal Church of the Living God, of which Rabbi Wentworth authored Matthew, 1892-1973, and many of y'all should know who Rabbi Wentworth is, right? One of the great black rabbis of the 20th century was the minister for a while, was founded at Steel Springs, Tennessee. The church maintained that most of the biblical prophets and other figures, including Jesus, were members of the black race, and these ideas reached directly into black milieus. By the time of the Church of the Living God was founded, the black counter theology, with its new racial configuration that inserted all blacks into sacred history, was already internalized by many black American Christians. In 1906, with the success among blacks of the Azusa Street revival in Los Angeles, the Pentecostalist movement spread through the black churches in Tennessee, Georgia, and the Carolinas. In this way, some of the specific notions of Anglo-Israelism and a black manifestation spread throughout the black communities. The racialized ideas of Anglo-Israelism and some of the early manifestations of the Pentecostal movement that rose from it gave a religious justification, as we have seen, for the widespread notions of the white Protestant supremacy. The racial religious ideas of Anglo-Israelism were to be endlessly replicated over the next half century as an analogous counter theology sprang up, partly influenced by them as a kind of mirror image among African Americans and later among Africans. For many blacks, the idea of being able to shed their skin and become racially white through the adoption of Jewish racial identity seemed attractive. Father Divine, the charismatic cult leader, famously abolished race for his followers, the concept was not allowed. There was no black or white. The words such as Negro or nigger was banned. Others tried to pass in white society. Various Muslim groups, such as the More Science Movement, similarly maintained that American blacks were Asiatic and they refused to be categorized as blacks. To distance themselves from the hated appellation of nigger, they awarded each other honorific Muslim titles such as Bey. Now I want to stop there and make notation on that. To this day, people still teach that. And I teach that because of the negative connotations associated with the word. Even in this book, if we go earlier into the earlier chapters, if you check out our other videos, I read every other chapter as well, including the preface and the introduction. It talks about how black denoted not having a past, being primitive. And that's how the word was being utilized in colonial America. So if you know that history and you understand the negative connotation of the word, why would you want to be associated with it? Because a lot of people will be like, well, you just hate yourself. No, you hate the terminology. You don't want to be associated with a negative terminology. That's the point. And that's what these groups were saying. And this is why they were banning this term and shunning the term. A lot of you guys have glorified the term now. Anyway, moving on. Let's read on. The black racialized counter-theologies created new theories about the lost tribes and novel justifications of demonstrating how blacks descended from them. One major proof lay in the fact that there were thought to be black Jews in Africa who arrived there from Israel in ancient times. The travel and missionary literature that supported this idea was as available on the American side of the Atlantic as it was in Europe, and some educated whites knew about it. In addition, by the middle of the 19th century, black intellectuals involved in the struggle against slavery in the United States had a number of proof texts to draw on, written by black authors to support this conviction. One was Aluda Equiano's 1789 anti-slavery classic, which, as he has seen, suggested a Jewish descent for the Igbo. Another was a textbook of the origin and history of colored people, 1841, the important and scholarly book written by the former slave Charles Pennington from 1807 to 1870, which mentioned in passing that there were black Jews on the coast of Africa who originally came from Judea. Now I want to stop there and add a tidbit to that. Most likely this person was actually referring to the Jews of Lawango. And Mr. Parfitt himself, he wrote his book, Hybrid Hate. And he actually gives credence to the Jews of Lawango as being authentic Jews, being black Jews, and also being authenticated. So that actually has some historical merit to it. Let's keep reading. Pennington mentioned the existence of these black Jews in such a matter-of-fact way without bothering to give any references to his assertion, which elsewhere he did throughout his book, that it can only be assumed that the presence of black Jews in Africa, presumably on the West Coast, was an accepted fact in the black abolitionist milieu in which he moved. The same ideas were expressed even more forcibly by Africanus Horton, 1835 to 1883, whose famous book was such a powerful rebuttal to white racism that it soon became well known among African American intellectuals and preachers. As Horton, along with Edward Wilmot, Blyden, Martin Robinson Delaney, and Henry Sylvester Williams, was soon to be recognized as one of the leading black thinkers of the time. By the second half of the 19th century, Israelite ideas supported by the science of the time formed part of the shared codes of knowledge of the Black Atlantic world. In Lost Tribes and Jews in Africa, ideas flowed in both directions. No doubt the chief mechanism for African Americans' enchantment with the idea of the lost tribes was the Bible, to which they had been unenthusiastically introduced in the slave farms of the South. In the United States, it was the Bible, as mediated initially by white slave owners and preachers, that was the catalyst of the internalization of the Israelite trope. At the beginning of the 19th century, very few black Africans in Africa were Christian. And the slaves who arrived in the Americas were rarely Christians, although some were Muslims. Throughout the 19th century, the black population of the United States was exposed to a greater or lesser extent to Christianity, or at the very least to some biblical stories. This led to a new sacred, metaphorical, and later imagined world being created by blacks based on the Bible, which was to provide a haven from the racial contempt to which they were universally subjected. Black preachers such as J.P. Campbell saw the Bible not just as a haven, but also as the most powerful defense in every way against those who describe Black Africans as an inferior race fit only for eternal servitude. I have to speak on that. Let me stop. Because you got many people on the internet, on YouTube, social media, that be like, oh, well, what has Black Israelism done for our people? What has that Israelite stuff done for our people? You got to understand that this was used as a defense and encouragement for people that was oppressed, for our ancestors that was going through one of the worst, heinous times in human history, period, known as the transatlantic slave trade, where they were told they were primitive, they had no history, and they had no culture. They turned to the Bible and they turned to this new belief and this ideology to counter that. So yes, it did do something positive and good. It became a powerful defense. So even if you don't believe in the notion that they are Israelites, at least you could do is say, okay, yeah, that actually did help. Let's keep reading. It says the Bible and its stories then were used both as a way of justifying slavery and racist attitudes, and also as a means of defending against them. Motifs of hope, revenge, and deliverance, such as opening the Red Sea to allow the Israelites to escape and their enemies to drown, the defeat of Goliath by David, the building of Noah's Ark as a means of avoiding destruction, the vengeance wreaked by the blinded Samson upon his sadistic tormentors, all fed into the construction of a new metaphorical identity in which Black slaves increasingly imagine themselves as Israelites, toiling in North American Egypt, brutalized by North American pharaohs, awaiting for their Moses who would take them to the freedom's land. Despite the lack of literacy among most African slaves, the Old Testament stories, and particularly the narrative of the suffering and subsequent deliverance of the Hebrews of Egypt, oppressed by the crushing might of Pharaoh, spread throughout the slave communities. Slaves were able to access the narratives of the Hebrew Bible through a number of means. Some came through spirituals, like when Israel was in Egypt's land, or wade in the water. Everybody remember wade in the water, children. We all know that song, right? Those were Negro spirituals back then. Let's keep reading. It says, referring to the crossing of the Red Sea, and famously sung by Harriet Tubman as warning to runaway slaves to stick to the water to put the pursuing dogs off their scent. It is easy to see how a process of identification started. Some stories passed by the word of mouth, occasionally through Black preachers such as George Liles, 1750-1820, and through the work of the early Black churches in the South, or through more benign white slave owners whose domestic slaves might be taught some rudiments of reading and could then read the Bible themselves if they were lucky enough to get their hands on one. Frederick Douglass, 1818 to 1895, the Black American social reformer, learned to read from white children in the neighborhood and from observing the men with whom he worked, writing and reading. Some of these Bible stories were transmitted by Muslim slaves who related to Quranic versions of the Hebrew narratives. In the Quran, Moses was emphasized as the supreme deliverer, and the story of the splitting of the waters of the Red Sea was described in loving detail. And that's another side that's not being taught. I mean, commentary here. A lot of our understanding, or some of our understanding, was coming from the Muslim slaves. Let's read on, because a lot, and there's a book, The Forgotten Turks, that talks about a lot of the slaves coming from certain areas of Africa, understood Islam. They had understanding of the Bible and the Quran. So we weren't presented. It wasn't. For a lot of us, it wasn't something new when we came, or our ancestors wasn't something new to our ancestors, at least some of them. Let's keep reading. Some of the American Black Jews started life in the West Indies and got their earliest introduction to biblical stories around about the end of the 19th century through patriarchal plays at Christmas time, by which people in the islands were reminded from year to year that they were the children of the house of Israel. That's in the West Indies. It says in Nevis and St. Kitts, roving bands, a dozen or more actors would act out various themes of to the accompaniment of music. The plays had titles such as Children of Israel, Samson, Delilah, but also Indians and Cowboys and Tarzans of the Apes. The biblical plays were adapted from an overwritten work of Hannah More, a member of the London Blue Stocking Circle and anti-slavery activist called Sacred Dramas, which was first published in 1782. The narratives thus enabled blacks to perceive this traumatic dislocation in redemptive light through an identification with the tribulations of the Hebrews, perhaps filtered through a distant memory of African tradition. Deliverance, hold on, this is the words of Tudor Parfitt, perhaps filtered through a distant memory of African tradition. So, again, he's open to the idea that these things could have came from an African tradition or memory of an African tradition. Keep that in mind, because a lot of people act as if Tudor Parfitt is not objective with his research, and he is. He gives you the pros and cons. He gives you the caveats to the story. All right, let's keep reading. It said, deliverance from bondage. The bondage of Egypt is one of the great themes in the Old Testament, and it was one that had great resonance for American black slave population. Indeed, the name Moses was regularly appropriated to propel black leaders into this metaphorical sacred history of Israel. These include Harriet Tubman, 1820 to 1913, the Moses of the Underground Railroad, and Marcus Garvey, supporter of black nationalism and founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League. And we also read about Marcus Garvey that he was using Hebrew ideology as well. In his own words, he said Africa was full of Hebrews. All right, so let's keep reading. He said, he who was known as the Black Moses, the African-American prophet William S. Crowdy, whom we shall soon be considering, when he was a little slave boy, got down on his knees and even prayed to Moses. This motif continued in 1966. Rabbi L. A. McCatton, a student of Wentworth Arthur Matthew, founder of the Black Jewish movement, the Commandments Keepers, noted that our leader, our emancipator, proved to be not just a man, but the man. Many have referred to him as being 7 men in one, truly another great Moses. Some of the magical and so-called Kabbalistic aspects of Black Israelite teachings were taken from William Lawrence edition of the 6 and 7 books of Moses, circa 1900. Occasionally banned as subversive by colonial authorities in the West Indies, which was a manual of magic that claims to divulge the Kabbalistic secrets of Moses and the ancient Hebrews in general. In the paradigm of the biblical Exodus under the inspiring leadership of Moses, African Americans found the essential expression of their longing for freedom. Yvonne Sherrill has written, projecting their own lives into the Old Testament accounts, African Americans recast their destiny in terms of the consummation of a divine drama, the event of the Exodus. Some blacks were owned by Jews or were otherwise connected to Jews in some way. One black slave known as Old Billy Simmons claimed improbably to be a Jew from Madagascar and apparently had knowledge of Hebrew and Arabic. He was admitted to the Bet Elohim synagogue in Charleston, and in antebellum South was probably unique, although a dark-skinned Jew, a mulatto Jew, was seen in a journey between Boston and New Hampshire in 1668. In any event, the Jewish community of the United States was very small, and direct Jewish influence on African-American community was minimal. So anyone saying, well, a lot of you guys turned to Judaism or turned to this knowledge because your slave master was quote-unquote Jew, well, that was minimal. That was a very small Ashkenazian community that was in America. It wasn't that many. I think it was less than 2,500, if I remember correctly. So that argument is a moot point. But let's keep reading. Charleston was the second biggest concentration of Jews in North America at the time of the 1790 census. There were 188 Jews in Charleston and only 242 in New York, which was the biggest concentration. By the second half of the 19th century, the situation had changed after the wave of Jewish immigration that followed the Russian pogroms of the 1880s and occasionally before, African Americans often found themselves in the same towns and cities, sometimes even neighborhoods, as Jews. The Jews were relatively more prosperous and may have been emulated in part for this reason. In their interactions, American Jews treated blacks in a fairly sympathetic way. In the Yiddish and English language Jewish press, African Americans were often referred to as Jews of America. This identification was, of course, metaphorical, invoking the suffering for both Jews and blacks had endured at the hand of history. But the Jews, any comparison between Jew and black that transcended this kind of metaphor was puzzling. Jews confronted with black Jews from Harlem, for instance, did not know what to make of them. The New York Sun of January 29, 1929 reported, Mr. M. Shapiro, a mild-mannered Jewish businessman, stopped to chat a few moments with a kosher butcher. The butcher was chuckling. Funny thing, he explained, some colored people came in this morning and wanted some kosher meat. Real Negro people from up in Harlem, they say they are Jews, he laughed. On the other hand, it was no doubt the proximity of Jews and blacks, particularly in New York, that underlies some of the undoubted fascination the two communities had for each other. In 1929, an African-American converted to Judaism, changed his name from James Harding to Jacob Abramowitz, because, as he put it, he had spent so much time with Jews that he wanted to become one. The flow of cultural knowledge between the two communities in American cities was considerable. The symbiosis between the two groups sometimes took the form of changing places, almost a change of skins, as one group graphically adopted the guise of the other. Exchanges included African Americans studying the Talmud, speaking Yiddish, eating typically Eastern European food, and dressing in Orthodox Jewish garb. One Jewish observer noted, the Negro Jews of Harlem claimed to be full-blooded Jews of color. They use the Orthodox prayer book and pray in the same singing voice that one is accustomed to hear in the synagogues of Eastern Europe. Even the herring, favorite food of poor Lithuanians, has found its way into the dining of these Negro Jews. There it has attained prominence never reached among white Jews and had become almost a part of the ritual. There were black singers who were learning to sing Yiddish and Hebrew songs, and black actor Reb Tuvia, who learned Yiddish and played in all the Yiddish theaters in New York, starring in a Yiddish play called Yenta Telabenta. On the Jewish side, from early jazz to the bands of the swing era and bebop, Jews were intimately involved with jazz as impresarios, composers of jazz standards, as record producers, and so on. Irving Berlin composed Negro songs, and Al Jolson and Eddie Cantor famously sang black southern songs in blackface, explicitly changing skins. And although this has been taken as demeaning to African Americans, such was probably not the intention at the time. Indeed, as Jews were widely regarded as black, or at least as not white, let me highlight that. Jews were widely regarded as black, or at least not white. The adoption of blackface may be read in a number of ways. In part, it was creating a bridge to whiteness by loudly proclaiming the necessity for Jews to paint their face black in order to be black. Taking the practice more literally, a reviewer for the American Yiddish newspaper, The Daily Forward, asks, is there any incongruity in a Jewish boy, Al Johnson, with his face painted like a Southern Negro singing a Negro dialect? No, there is not. I detected again and again the minor key of Jewish music, the wail of the chazan, the cry of anguish of a people who have suffered. The son of a line of rabbis well knows how to sing the songs of the most cruelly wronged people in the world's history. Al Jolson, who was the highest paid entertainer in the United States by the 1930s, has been credited with introducing black popular culture to white audiences in the wider world, and also with paving the way for the admission of African Americans into the dominant entertainment culture of the day. So that's a piece of history that you guys didn't know, or probably didn't know. So let's keep reading. It says, nonetheless, the juxtaposition of blacks with their own growing identification with Israelites or some other Middle Eastern or Ethiopian people and the newly arrived, the Paise, Yiddish-speaking Russian Jews suffering their own multiple dislocations was unfortunate. Jews anxious to assimilate into white America was haunted by the fear that they were not white themselves. White American Jews found it difficult to take black Jews very seriously, being refugees from virulent anti-Semitism as most of them were. They probably wondered why anyone not born a Jew would want to claim to be one. Despite Jewish incomprehension and resistance, there was nonetheless a good deal of black emulation of specifically Eastern European Jewish religious culture. In general terms, the black Judaic religions that were created in the United States did not need and ultimately did not always seek legitimation by mainstream Jewry. As Michael Saltall has put it, the essentialist definition of Judaism can never explain or account for the diversity of Jewish religious life, both today and through history. Judaism is best seen not as a monolithic system, but rather a family of traditions, which includes a rich assortment of disparate religious cultures. The adoption of the Israelite racial trope by blacks was part of a much wider phenomenon. By the 1860s, racialization of the globe, to use Frank Dakota's phrase, was well underway, and racial explanation and solutions were being advanced everywhere. An important factor, which we have seen above, was the development of the new racialized African identity based upon the different aspects of the Hamitic myth, which were to take on an even more robust form in the United States. Afrocentric ideas had appealed to American blacks since the first half of the 19th century. Books glorifying African past and emphasizing the key role of Africans in the great civilization of the ancient world, particularly Egypt, were produced in considerable numbers by black Africans from the 1830s on. One of the most remarkable and articulate of the men who argued for the new racial configuration of blacks through the paradigm of the greatest of ancient African Hamitic civilizations was the ex-slave James William Charles Pennington, mentioned above. In 1841, he wrote the textbook of the origin and history of the colored people, which dealt with current issues surrounding blackness and race, and very ably, systematically, and ironically refuted white claims to innate racial superiority. Now, this is the same guy who wrote about the Jews on the West Coast, the black Jews on the West Coast of Africa. He also mentioned the black Portuguese as well. It says one of the key underpinnings of white racism, as we have seen, was the idea that Africans descended from the biblical Ham, cursed by Noah, and that they were forever condemned to serve their white masters, and that their blackness was a visible sign of the curse. Pennington rejected the blasphemous assertion that color and slavery were connected with the biblical story and stressed that in any case it was Canaan, not Ham, who was cursed. Another black writer in 1859 argued that there was countless instances of white people as well as blacks being taken in involuntary servitude, and that Noah was not a prophet and his curse carried little weight, not least because he was drunk when he made it. Pennington argued that as descendants of Ham, blacks were in fact the heirs of great cultural achievements in the land of Ham. Without Egyptian Hamitic civilization, modern Western civilization would not have been possible. The first general fact, he wrote, is that the arts and sciences had their origin with our ancestors, and from them have flown forth to the world. They gave them to Greece, Greece to Rome, Rome to others. Pennington and others rejected any suggestion that blacks were inferior, claimed that they were descended from illustrious pedigree, and refused to let whites distort the Bible for their own purposes. In the same way as throughout the 19th centuries and unto today, whites have constructed certain African societies as Hamites, and many black Africans have embraced this proud Hamitic past as a means of countering white racial slurs or promoting their own ethnic group. So did African Americans. Pennington finished off his book referring to, as we have seen, to the black descendants of a colony of Jews originally from Judea on the coast of Africa. He does not specify, but it's almost certain that he had West African in mind. It was not long before the idea that there were some black Jews in Africa gave way to the less widespread idea that all of or most blacks were in fact Jews, descended from Jews, and that the central figures in the Judeo-Christian traditions were black. The large black Pentecostal group, Church of Living God, maintained that most of the biblical prophets and other figures, including Jesus, were members of the black race. Later, the African Orthodox Church, founded in 1921 by George Alexander McGuire under the influence of Marcus Garvey, was essentially a black racialized form of the Protestant Episcopal Church, while the shrine of the Black Madonna Church and Cultural Centers founded by the anti-integrationist Bishop Albert B. Cleage, 1911 to 2000, in Atlanta and Detroit, and others were simply offering a plausible alternative to the white skin and blue-eyed racial iconography of Western Christendom. Bishop Cleage identified the white Jews of the United States as the descendants of white Europeans and Asiatics who converted to Judaism about 1,000 years ago. Now, real quick, that statement has been proven a lot of in the numerous ways. Genetic studies show that. Arthur Koestler showed that in his book, The 13 Tribes. A lot of these men are coming from the Ashina tribes or the Khazars. So that has been actually proven. That's not even up for debate. I'll just keep reading. It says, with the humiliation and debasement of slavery, a recent and painful memory and racial slurs and slight against blacks still imminent, there was a desire to reject any notion of innate white superiority and vindicate African peoples, equality, and perhaps superiority through a new racial paradigm drawn from Scripture. The theological traditions of the West for these black vindictionists were little more than a falsification of history designed to erase blacks from their rightful place in Scripture. Black theologians were convinced that the real Jesus bore little resemblance to the pseudo-Christ of the Western tradition of religious art. In a rejection of white Jesus, there was a redemptive element. As Henry McNaim Turner, 1834 to 1915, a bishop in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, put it, why should not the Negro believe that he resembles God as much so as other people? We do not believe there is any hope for a race of people who do not believe that they look like God. Now, there's a point about this as well. This has been vindicated and validated because we all know that image of what we call Jesus Christ is actually Caesar Borgia. That's not even hidden no more. That's actually Caesar Borgia. Was it Michelangelo? I forget who painted it. He painted the Borgia family as different prophets and apostles and stuff like that. And he chose Caesar Borgia to represent Christ. So that's all empirical at this point. But let's keep reading. Afro-Judaic versions of these radical racialized orientations would soon burst upon the world and spread throughout the United States, Central America, and Africa itself. The Church of God and the Saints of Christ, founded in 1896 by W.S. Crowdy, based itself on the claim that the 10 lost tribes were the ancestors of black people. The rival commandment keepers defined black people as the true descendants of the tribe of Judah, but claimed that the 10 lost tribes were in fact the white race. In the 1920s, a rabbi of the Black Jews of Harlem declared that the African Hebrew heritage belonged to blacks alone and included Phalash, the Queen of Sheba, and the tribes of West Africa. In other words, the real Jews were Africans and only Africans. The white Jews were fakes, or at least of secondary importance. There was two outstanding historical proofs for this contention. One was the widely reported presence of black Jews in West Africa, and other was the even more richly attested presence of black Jews in Ethiopia in the form of Beta Israel or Phalash. The trope of Ethiopia in general had been important for black Americans throughout the 19th century and symbolized the idea that African Americans had a connection with the ancient black Christian civilization of Ethiopia, and that their history in Western Christian terms anyway extended beyond the Middle Passage. The magnificent Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, New York, which was founded in 1808 and which was known to everyone living in the area, was one of the largest black congregations in the United States, as well as a local landmark. The church broke away from its parent Baptist church on the issue of segregated seating and allegedly owes its name to the Ethiopian seamen who formed part of its original congregation, which I believe is unlikely. There are black churches with Abyssinia in their title in Detroit, Dallas, Cleveland, and throughout the United States. The connection with Abyssinia was symbolically to assert the dignity of black American Christians of various denominations. The importance of Ethiopia as a symbol of black pride was emphasized in 1896 with the success of black Ethiopian troops against a European colonial power at the Battle of Adwa, where the Ethiopians massacred heavily outnumbered Italians. This was the first time that an African country had resisted a serious European attempt to invade it. The Ethiopian historian Baru Zude noted that few events in modern period have brought Ethiopia to the attention of the world as has the victory of Adwa. The racial dimension was that what lent Adwa particularly significance, it was the victory of blacks over whites. The impact of the Battle of Adwa was to heighten the mysterious impressions Ethiopia conveyed to Afro-Americans, as well as the outside world, and it has also conjured up the symbol of Ethiopian as the Zion in Africa in the minds of vast numbers of Afro-Americans, as well as Africans living under colonial rule. Following the Battle of Adwa, a number of black churches in the United States started developing the literalist notion that the Israelites of old were black Africans who had started out in Ethiopia. One such was a church founded in Wrightsville, a small rural village south of Little Rock, Arkansas, by William Christian, who was born into slavery in Mississippi in 1856. His message was essentially that Adam, King David, and King Solomon, Job, Jeremiah, Moses' wife, the Queen of Sheba, and Jesus Christ were all black. His church, the Church of the Living God, which combined elements of holiness and Freemason belief, spread rapidly among poor Southern blacks. And by 1906, there were 68 congregations in 12 states. In 10 years later, 192 congregations. I also want to make a point by this because, years ago, Garfield will be like, show me a slave that said he was a Jew. And I'm like, you got plenty of slaves saying that. And this is one, William Christian, ex-slave, started to teach that and came to the realization of that. So a lot of this stuff, a lot of these questions these guys ask or pose are made because they're ignorant and they don't read. And it's just that simple. All right, it says, let me go back. I think I skipped it. Hold on. There we go. It says his racialized theology used same exegetical mechanisms as the Anglo-Israelites. He simply replaced whites with blacks, and his church has been termed the first black supremacy organization in the United States. In 1914, Bishop John A. Hickerson, 1876 to 1965, who also went by the names Father Divine, Reverend Bishop St. John Divine, and others founded the Church of the Living God, the pillar and ground of truth in Harlem, identified himself completely as Ethiopian, and taught a variation of New Thought, the spiritual movement that had started in the 1830s in England and the United States. The importance of Ethiopia for the development of black religions claiming Israelite ancestry can hardly be overemphasized. The apocalyptic ideology of Ethiopianism nurtured at its heart a vision of a holy, redeemed Africa, freed of colonial yoke in Ethiopia through its long history and current unique role in Africa, offered a justification for the new Afrocentric perspectives that were being developed. For many, the verse from Psalm 68:31, "Princes shall come out of Egypt, Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto God," became a key proof text in establishing black claims to sacred history. In addition, up-to-date information from Ethiopia was brought by prominent Ethiopians such as Kantaba Governor Gabriel Desta, who visited the black Jews in Harlem in 1919, or Wagner H2 Martin, who visited in 1927. And evidently, there was a huge amount of information on the press about the coronation of Haile Selassie in 1930. The existence of Falasha or Beta Jews was brought to the attention of the West primarily through Bruce travels to discover the source of the Nile, and by the 19th century, it was widely known that there were Jews in Ethiopia. American Jews received recent news of Falasha in various Jewish journals from the beginning of the 20th century and were certainly aware of their existence. Jacques Feitlovich, 1881-1955, the champion of the Ethiopian Beta Israel among world Jewry, visited the United States several times after 1911 and stayed for several months on each occasion. His visits, intended primarily to raise financial support for Beta Israel, were covered extensively in the Jewish and general press. Thus, in New York, elsewhere, the presence of flesh and blood black Jews in Ethiopia became known. It was also worth noting that Feitlovich conceived of Beta Israel as part of the Jewish race rather than as converts to Judaism, believed that their ancestors formed part of the Jewish garrison in Elephantine, Egypt. Now that's huge. That's huge, because what was also happening during this period, because I'm reading another book about the Elephantine papyri, is people are starting to dig up the Elephantine papyri. The Amherst papyri is being discovered in Egypt in the late 19th century, I believe around 1890 to 1900, around that period. The man found it, and his daughter found another papyri, and they started seeing that there were Jews, there were Aramaic Jews or Aramaic Sumerians in Egypt. And then we had evidence of them being in Aswan, Egypt, in Elephantine. So they were putting 2 to 2 together. It's like, wait a minute, these people can be converts. They could easily be these Jews that were posted in Elephantine and Aswan. And what's very important and very significant about that is you have the Soninke people of West Africa, the people that found Ghana, or as it was called back then, Ouagadougou. These people claim to be descendants of Sonin, are coming from Sonin. Sonin is Aswan, Egypt. Aswan is famous because that was a place where the Arameans or these Jews were fleeing to. And they're saying that they come from that area in Egypt, which gives credence to Beta Israel, gives credence to Soninke being Jews. It just opens up the realm of possibilities, so to speak. So let's get back to the literature. We're on page, I believe, 74, lower paragraph. Other Jewish lost tribes enthusiasts of the time, such as Nahum Sluch, 1872-1969, argued that the Falasha were descended from Jewish captives taken to Ethiopia in the 9th century BCE. And also I want to add that Nahum Sluch, he did a great work with his travels in North Africa when he was actually going to see various Jewish groups, and he mentioned that how they look physically. And he mentioned that some of them were of a fine and dark type. That was his words. Let's keep reading. The Falasha constituted one of the most powerful pieces of evidential proof in that the Judaism movements within the black population in the United States could muster. The black Jews of Harlem, Howard Broats, famously observed that the discovery of the existence of the Falasha for those African Americans who invoked their Judaic past was the missing link, proving the legitimacy of their claims. Also, I want to say this, and we're going to read on. I know y'all want to hear this, but for anybody saying that this book is all about converts, you obviously didn't read it. I just want to put that out there because I just read a portion where it said these people were actually literal descendants of the Elephantine Jews. So you obviously didn't read it. Reading on, it said, if there had been any doubts about the Judaic origins of all or some American blacks, the attested nature of the published reports about Beta Israel settled the question of their identity in a scientific manner. There was already some knowledge in some African American circles of black Jewish communities in West Africa, and the existence of Beta Israel was further greased to their meal. If there were genuine Jews in Africa, whether they were in Ethiopia or in West Africa who were black, there could be nothing inherently aberrant in the idea of black Jews. And given that the history of tradition of black Ethiopian Jews went back 3,000 years to the time of King Solomon, who could possibly say the Jews had to be white? One recent book written by a black Jew, The African Origins of Modern Judaism, had argued that Abraham and all the people he converted, included all the central characters of the Hebrew tradition, went to Ethiopia, where they became known as Falasha. The Falasha of Beta Israel thus became key players in the legitimation of Israelites in Africa thesis. E. Trevisan Simi writes, tellingly of black people's interest in the possibility of sharing a myth that spoke of royal descent, Lions of Judah, and Abyssinian princes, as a stratagem for transcending the bitter memories of slavery and creating a noble history that could compare favorably with that of white Americans. There was a strong tendency among African Americans to treat Africa as a symbolic place, the noble home of virtuous blacks, the potential site where a denigrated race could reclaim its dignity. There was then lofty, idolized Ethiopia, which many blacks identified metaphorically and spiritually. However, sometimes African Americans would identify with Ethiopia to the extent that they would pass themselves off literally and insistently as Ethiopian Jews. Some which were seen preaching in Chicago in 1913 One of them told the publisher of the Weekly Defender, a black Chicago newspaper, that he had come from Abyssinia to lead the blacks of Chicago to an understanding of their true Jewish African heritage, and that he planned to rebuild Solomon's temple, calling themselves the International Peace and Brotherly Love Movement. These Abyssinian Jews offered to give lectures about their homeland and home community and hoped to convince Chicago's white Jews that the real Jews were black. In 1920, a journalist from Yiddish newspaper Forwards, the Daily Forwards, was approached by a black man who was collecting money for an organization he called the Hebrew Settlement Workers, which turned out to be in Harlem. The group's leaders claimed to be from Palestine and Ethiopia and had come to bring the Torah to American black populations who were the only authentic Jews in the world. In 1927, a New York Jew was present at a black Jewish circumcision ceremony and observed that the participants called themselves Falasha and made no attempt to imitate normative Jewish practices in any way. The Falasha do not claim to be Jews. They do not pretend to be the sons of any one of the lost tribes of Israel. They are Falasha, and theirs is the Jewish faith. The faith of the white Jews, they feel, is merely a corruption of their own religion or perhaps an entirely different one. The group, perhaps more influenced by the Falasha Beta Israel discourse, however, was the commandment keepers of the Royal Order of the Ethiopian Hebrews. And I know many of my audience should know about the commandment keepers with Rabbi Wentworth and Ford. Let's keep reading. The congregation led by Wentworth, Arthur Matthew, this royal order was put forward as a kind of lodge of the congregation of the commandment keepers and was given various slightly different names until the end of the 1980s. Falasha Order of African Jews, Union of Ethiopian Hebrew Congregation and Rabbis, led by C.M. Craig, Temple Society of Ethiopian Hebrews, Ethiopian Hebrew Congregation, etc. Beth Shalom B'nai Zion, Ethiopian Hebrew Congregation, which is still active, is the oldest temple in Chicago area, serving the Israelite community, and was established as the Ethiopian Hebrew Association in 1915. In 1967, 77-year-old black man called Father Abraham, who always claimed to be Falasha and hailed from the Falasha community in New York, was buried in the cemetery of a Detroit synagogue. These claims to be Falasha or have immigrated in recent times from Ethiopia were false, and the people and institutions concerned had nothing to do with the Ethiopian Jews. The only contact with real Beta Israel came sometime between 1921 and 1931, and Tamar Emmanuel, 18 to 1963, one of the Ethiopian Beta Israels whom Federlich had sent to Europe to be educated, visited the United States. But the general appeal to Ethiopian Jews was not the result of his visit. The Beta Israel served primarily as a legitimating mechanism in a historical sense, as it did in the 20th century among the variety of analogous black Jewish groups in Africa. It was proof that could be deployed with black Christians who doubted the legitimacy of black Jews' claims, and even more pertinently, it could be used as a counter of wounding doubts and concerns of American Jews. In more recent times, particularly in the wake of the publicity surrounding Operation Moses, the first Israeli operation to rescue Beta Israel from the Sudan in 1985, the legitimating utility of the Beta Israel has been lost on a number of African Jewish or Judaizing communities, which include the Limba in South Africa, the Bakwadeshi in Congo, and many others. Perhaps the oldest black Jewish organization in the United States was the Church of Living God, the Pillar Ground of Truth for All Nations, which was founded in Chattanooga, Tennessee, around 1886 by Prophet Frank S. Cherry. A self-educated black seaman, laborer, and railroad employee from the Deep South. According to his own account, he was traveling in a distant land and had a vision in which he was shown to be a prophet whose destiny was to be found, to found a church and to explain to the world that whereas all blacks were not Jews, all true Jews were black. White Jews were imposters. Prophet Cherry preached that the original white man was the biblical Gehazi who became white as a result of the curse placed upon him, 2 Kings 5:27. So anybody still teaching that, this is where it comes from. This is where that teaching comes from. Cherry was teaching that. Cherry taught himself Hebrew and Yiddish. Always kept Hebrew and Yiddish books next to him as he preached, and on Monday evenings organized Hebrew classes for the congregants. He claimed that the fundamental text of the community was the Talmud. The rituals of Cherry's group included a number of Jewish practices. Congregants faced east when they prayed. Men wore skull caps. Women had blue and white capes with tassels at the ends in imitation of the Talatot. The Sabbath day and Passover was celebrated. The prohibition of pork was observed. Members were discouraged from making images such as photographs of human beings. There were also a number of Christian practices, including gospel singing. Cherry's group was following 10 years later. And in 1896, by the establishment in Kansas of the Church of God and Saints of Christ, led by Prophet William Saunders Crowdy, 1847-1908, which expanded rapidly, first into a couple dozen centers in Texas and soon throughout the country. Crowdy was born into slavery. His early life was harsh, yet he learned to read and was drawn to Hebrew prophets and particularly Moses. His message was clear. Blacks were quite literally the chosen people. Their role in the divine plan was not a metaphor. It was historical truth that had been divinely ordained. His followers was thus cast as central players in Judeo-Christian narrative. Crowdy served in the Union Army in the Civil War and eventually, having gained his freedom, became quartermaster sergeant in the 5th Cavalry. He was discharged from the Army in 1872. 20 years later, in 1892, having worked as a cook on the Santa Fe Railways, he acquired 100-acre ranch in an all-black town, Oklahoma, said to be at that time the biggest black-owned ranch in the United States. It was during this period, the beginning of Jim Crow, and the time of horrific lynching of blacks, Indians, and white rustlers, that Crowdy had a vision and a revelation. It was a revelation that was calculated to help African Americans avoid the stigma of racial inferiority. It was a revelation that blacks were in fact descended from the Israelites. The speed and relative ease with which Crowdy managed to disseminate this message are testament to the prevalence of the redemptive notion of the Israelites in the American imagination in general. Following his vision, Crowdy started preaching a very strict version of the Old Testament Judaism, which, despite the name of the organization, was not and is not orthodoxly Christian. And that Jesus is regarded by the movement as a good historical Jew and little more. Is not taken to be the savior of mankind, and there's no belief in the Trinity. It is perhaps significant that the tenets of the movement place particular emphasis on the redemptive role of Moses and Exodus from Egypt, and their main religious feast is the Passover, which celebrates the deliverance of the Hebrews. It is clear that Crowdy's movement was a crystallization of a metaphorical identification of African American slaves with the Israelites and cherished narrative of the Exodus, which had been so important in the first half of the 19th century, as J. Dorman puts it. Crowdy began to systematically adopt the rituals of the Hebrew Bible, beginning with the 7-day Sabbath and continuing with the Passover and the other festivals of the Hebrew calendar. Through their joint efforts, Bishop Christian and Crowdy seeded that African Americans' religious landscape with the conviction that the ancient Israelites were black, and created thousands of believers who had adopted some of the rites of the Hebrew Bible to go along with the conviction that the Hebrew and Christian Bibles were describing their own ancestors. In most cases, Judaic groups that arose in northern cities before and after the First World War were lineal descendants of Bishop Crowdy's Church of God and Saints of Christ, or Bishop Christian's Church of the Living God. In 1903, Crowdy sent emissaries abroad to South Africa and also to Cuba and West Indies. His movement has continued to prosper today. There are 50-odd tabernacles in the United States, mostly on the East Coast, 7 in South Africa, and a few in the West Indies. Swaziland, Malawi, and Mozambique, and the large and quite influential Black Jewish community in Rusape, Zimbabwe, can be traced back directly to his movement. So we can see that Crowdy had a huge impact, not only in the States, also in the West Indies and in Africa. Let's keep reading. It says, for years after founding of Crowdy's movement in 1900, Warren Robertson founded the Temple of the Gospel of the Kingdom in Virginia, whose members were required to learn Yiddish and to adopt Jewish ritual and liturgy. They moved to Harlem in 1917, where he established a sort of a commune, which is called a kingdom. Later, another kingdom was created in Atlanta, which was accused of being a baby farm where women members of his congregation bore Robinson's children. The community collapsed when Robinson was indicted on the charge of transporting women over state lines for immoral purposes. A similar group, the Moorish Science Temple, which was more exclusively Judaic in its belief, was founded by Rabbi Leon Rickalou of Brooklyn, New York. In 1899, Rickalou came to be of Ethiopian origin, to have been ordained by 3 rabbis and to have studied in an Orthodox yeshiva. The group later reformed under the leadership of Mordecai Herman, who set up branches in Philadelphia and in Newark, New Jersey. One of the most remarkable figures in the history of Black Jewish movements in the United States was Arnold Josiah Ford. Born in Barbados and a talented musician, he played violin, piano, string bass, and banjo, and performed in a well-known ragtime and jazz band. He became a musical director in Liberty Hall of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, and in this capacity composed Ethiopia, Thou Land of Our Fathers, the Garveyite national anthem, which the Yiddish newspaper in New York called the Negro Hatifa. O Jehovah, Thou God of the ages, grant unto our sons that lead the wisdom Thou gavest to Thy sages when Israel was sore in need. Ford, who was fluent in Yiddish, knew Hebrew well, studied the Bible and Talmud with white Jewish teachers. In 1923, he accepted the position of rabbi at the Bet B'nai Abraham Synagogue in Harlem and developed an eclectic religion, which drew liberally on magic, Kabbalah, Islam, Judaism, Pentecostalism, and Freemasonry. Most of the congregation claimed to be of Ethiopian origin. He set up a school in which Arabic and Hebrew were taught, with the idea that languages would be helpful in the movement for the resettlement of Africa, which became his driving ambition. He wore a kippah on his head and also a turban. He was much influenced by historical parallels between the blacks of America and the Jews, and by the fact that under Christianity, both Jew and black had been persecuted. They suffered side by side, he wrote. During the horrible years of the Christian Inquisition and the Christian slave trade in Africa, the West Indies, and South America, but his vision of Black Judaism was not simply comparative and metaphorical. Many of the hymns he composed not only demonstrated a fusion and synthesis of metaphorical analogies between Jewish and Black historical experience, but also included Ethiopianism and redemption of Africa. He was particularly inspired by the conviction that his forefathers, and therefore he himself, were Beta Israel, and it was an Ethiopian philosophy that he dreamed of returning home. In 1930, he and 3 members of the Black Jewish congregation embarked for Ethiopia on the crest of the Back to Africa movement launched by Marcus Garvey, which invited American blacks to go back, as Zionists did, to their place of origin. He participated in the coronation of Emperor Haile Selassie in 1930, created a school in Addis Ababa, and acquired 800 acres of not very productive land, with the idea of creating Black Jewish colony that would symbolically unite Black Jews of the diaspora with their brothers already in Ethiopia. Between 1932 and 1933, he was joined by 10 more Black Jews from New York. Little is known about Ford's time in Ethiopia. However, the Beta Israel and Ethiopia were not so sure about the link between them as he was. In any event, when he made them a generous gift of a Torah scroll, they spurned it on the ground that Hebrew was not the language of their liturgy, but Ge'ez. The scroll eventually made its way back to the United States. Ford, who played at the court of Haile Selassie a few times and kept a servant, as well as allegedly 4 concubines, died of a heart attack on a piece of land acquired by him at the age of 58 during the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. Nathan Irving Huggins has described Harlem at this time with its fine buildings, wide streets, Black Ethiopian churches, and other institutions, and its large growing African American population. As the capital of the Black world for many Black people, Addis Ababa was the other capital, and Ford's remarkable attempt to bridge the divide between the two was inspirational. He did it largely through the trope of the Beta Israel philosophy, which was a synthesis of several previous ideas: that blacks were real Jews descended from Ethiopians, and that blacks were descended from or related to Black Jews inhabiting the coast or interior of the African continent. Ford's message, which was projected onto a largely skeptical white world, included the key statement of proof. The black man is really the Ethiopian Falasha and the biblical Hebrews who were stripped of their name and religion during slavery. A number of other black Jewish groups emerged in different cities of the United States, including Chicago, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., as well as Harlem. In the early decades of the 20th century, the congregants were often small and sometimes did not outlive their founders. One of the most successful congregations was the Commandment Keepers, founded in 1919 in Harlem by Rabbi Wentworth A. Matthew, who later was to ordain many black rabbis who created black Jewish congregations throughout the United States and the Caribbean. And after Ford's immigration to Ethiopia, his congregation was taken over by Matthew. Matthew, like Ford, soon established himself and to construct the ethno-religious identity of his congregation as Ethiopian Hebrew. He stressed that the hated term Negro should never be used to refer to themselves, and proposed Hebrews of Ethiopian descent instead. By the time of Ford's departure to Ethiopia in 1930, Matthew announced that he and his congregation were in fact literally Falashas, not simply Ethiopian Hebrews, which seems a little vaguer, and that their identity had been lost or suppressed as a result of the long years of slavery. His personal biography was altered to reflect the new orientations, and he subsequently claimed that he had been born in a small Falasha village in Lagos, Nigeria. The grandson of a very famous Falasha preacher. A newspaper article later mentioned that he had knowledge of Hebrew, which he spoke with an Arabic accent. It is Palestinian Hebrew that he speaks, pure Hebrew, which he maintained had been spoken in a distant Falasha village in Lagos. His actual biography is barely less exotic. Born in St. Kitts rather than Lagos, he may have been a sailor and may even have visited Palestine before going to New York, where he lived for a while, earning his living as a boxer and wrestler. He had been a Pentecostalist minister with the Judaic Church of the Living God before he founded his own church. And it's during this period that he would have come across the lost tribe theories. His claims to have been a Falasha have been derided, but they reflect his belief that all blacks were in fact Ethiopian Hebrews. It follows, therefore, that the black home where he had been born was in some sense a kind of Falasha outpost, even if it was in St. Kitts rather than Lagos. Rabbi Matthew claimed his Judaism and his racial and ethnic identity came directly from Ethiopia via Nigeria to the West Indies, thus dramatically combining the two central proof communities of Jews in Africa theory, the Falasha and the Jews of West Africa. We have seen previously that the colonial inventions and hypotheses and travelers report about Jews in Africa were known as some American black circles. The discourse was responsible for the great deal in the United States, as it was in Africa. It was a source of great and life-enhancing inspiration to some and an efficient means of control and subjugation for others. There was also money to be made out of it. In the first few decades of the 20th century, Beta Kenda Mgoza Ibn Lo Bagola, 1877 and 1947. Rob Bourne loves bringing this guy up. This is the first person Rob Bourne goes to. Oh, look at this guy. You believe in him? And we know that Lo Bagola was a charlatan. I'm just going to spill it. I'm just going to spoil it before we get to it. All right, it says a self-proclaimed African made of good living out of his knowledge of this exotic discourse, which he had studied in part in London libraries, where he may have got some of the details for his tale in writing of the Scottish explorer Mungo Park. There's also common ground between his accounts and Aluda Equiano's. The interesting narrative. Equiano maintained that he was born the son of a chief around 1745 in an area called Igbo in Guinea. And at the age of 11 was seized and put on a slave ship. Lobagala claimed to be from the village of Nodagusa, 600 miles north of Abomey Calavi, and about 45 days walk north of the Gulf of Guinea, and 3 days walk south of the native city of Timbuktu. His village was in the Ondo bush, a horrible place because of the tall grass and bushes, and he too was the son of a chief, and he too was taken off to Britain against his will on a British ship. Lobagola had absorbed the ancient and more recent discourse about the Jews and Israelites in Black Africa. And he gave the idea a new lease of life in America and elsewhere. His Undo Bush was a place thus far undiscovered by whites, where Black Jews lived a free and pious existence without the inconvenience of clothes, celebrating their ancient traditions in only slightly heterodox form. In 1929, he published some articles about his adventures in about African Judaism. In the Illustrated Scrivener's Note magazine in the following year, the Note published these in a book under the Lobagola, an African Savage own story. So he really capitalized on this. If y'all doing research, don't use no Lobagola's articles. I'm letting y'all know that now. He was a charlatan. And we're going to reveal it. It says, the book made quite a splash, and for a while it was much discussed. Nof gave a lunch party for Lobagola, which was attended to by Nof authors like James Weldon Johnson, Carl Van Vechten, H.L. Mencken, Henry Seidel Canby, and Dashiell Hammett. In a favorable review, the Time magazine observed, a black man, but a Jew. He is native to the Undo Bush hinterland of Dahomey in Western Africa. His people, according to legend, left Palestine after Roman Titus' attack on Jerusalem, whereupon they fled to Morocco, to Timbuktu, and farther. There, swallowed up by African natives, they still remain a Jewish state, continue Jewish rights, says Lobagola. They carry out the ceremony of circumcision on the letter, although not in the same way as Palestinians today. Our rabbis, he said, permit us to only use our teeth and fingernails for the circumcision operation. His book was full of remarkable details about Jews of the Undo Bush and his own adventures in the Undo. The naked Jew spoke a dialect of Arabic mixed with a great deal of Hausa, Yoruba, and Banga vernaculars. His book explained how, as a result of some extraordinary mishaps, Lobagola finished up in Scotland, where he stayed for a while learning English. Time magazine, which did not seem to have any difficulty believing the account of the Jews of the Undo Bush, described Lobagola as a kind of elderly black Marx brother, short, stocky, gleaming eyes with black mustache, frizzly white hair, and concluded he looks like a stout little Jew in blackface. It appears that Lobagola was taken seriously by most of the people at the time. He traveled the world dressed up in a pastiche of African costume, bare chest adorned with many necklaces, and a big ring through his nose, giving lectures featuring an ethnographic exhibition that were popular at that time, and instructing urban students of anthropology about the savage and exotic life he had known at firsthand in his native Undo. His real biography was somewhat more mundane. His actual name was Joseph Howard Lee, and he had been born on to a dirt poor African family in Baltimore. So again, this is why I'm warning anybody out there, don't go looking up Lobagola and looking up his articles and stuff that was being published by Time magazine and trying to use it as proof text. This guy was a charlatan. He made all that stuff up. All right, it says one of the dupes of Lobagola was none other than the pioneering anthropologist R.R. Moret, the reader in social anthropology at Exeter College, Oxford, who virtually founded anthropology as a university subject in Great Britain. In 1911, Lobagola gave a talk at the Exeter College on fetishism, which he recalled made a hit. In the same year was a living exhibit at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, by far the best exhibit at the museum. Joseph Howard Lee, aka Lobagola, selected a Jewish racial identity as a way of avoiding the prejudice that was attached to being racially African American, in a way appropriating the best kind of African origins according to the Hamitic theory from one of the places where Black Jews were thought to reside. So he was using his academia and his knowledge of academia at that time to his advantage, of using an exotic identity to make these grandiose claims and make money off of it as well. Let's read on. Lobagola's fantastical account has quite incredibly entered academic literature as fact. His narrative started to take on a cloak of academic respectability in 1930 with a review of his book in the Journal of the Royal African Society by an African expert. The review did not question the authenticity of Lobogala's story, nor did it interrogate the critical assertion that there were naked black Jews in Undo Bush. It was only mildly anti-colonial stance of the books that was queried. More recently, in the Encyclopedia of the Jewish Diaspora Origins, Experience, and Culture, we read that some accounts placed West African Jewish communities in the Undo forests of Dahomey, south of Timbuktu in the 1930s. These groups still maintain a Torah scroll written in America that had been burned in parchment with hot iron instead of ink, so it could not be changed. But the editor, Avram Imrich, is by no means the only one to have unwittingly perpetuate the most egregious example of Jews in West Africa topos. So this story is still in circulation in some circuits. Let's keep reading. It is of some interest and significance of Williams' influential Hebrewism of West Africa and Lobogola's An African Savage Own Story were both published in 1930, the year of forced departure for Africa. Lobogola's Orientalist account of wild Jewish going on in African bush had been published in Scribner's the year before his departure. One can only wonder whether the stretching of the patriarchal society with few constraints, at least on men, one of Lobogola's chapter was called The Six Girls at Once, had played into Ford's decision to go, had colored his sense of what he would find when he got there, and if his decision to take 4 concubines and a wife was based in any way on the great impostor, Lobogola's fictitious 5 wives. One, you may recall, was sent off, mutilated, to join the Jewish king's Amazon's cohorts. Okay. The various expressions, let me make sure we're on the right page. Page 85. The various expressions of Black Judaism in the United States have been created out of a complex web of factors, which include discrimination as well as colonial inventions. As we have seen, the Black Atlantic world was and interconnected in a myriad of ways. African ideas about connections with Israelites crossed the Atlantic from the time of Equiano. And as we shall see at the beginning of the 20th century, there were complex connections between Americans and Africans that were to be productive of Israelite religions of different sorts in Africa. Similarly, Igbo claims of Israelite history, ancestry, and their Israelite traditions have been carried by Nigerian Igbo immigrants and refugees to the United States. Here they have had a legitimating role in Black American Jewish discourses. The Chicago-based African-American Rabbi Caper C. Fournier Jr. is an interesting case which well exemplifies the growing links between the African and African-American Judaic world. Born a Christian in the Jim Crow era, Fournier came to the view that Christianity was the religion of his white oppressor. Ordained eventually as a rabbi, he set up the Institute for Jewish and Community Research as an outreach organization and part of the Igbo in Nigeria. On one dramatic occasion in 2002, a group of Igbo immigrants met on a small island of St. Thomas, Georgia, at the so-called Igbo landing, where 13 chained-up Igbo slaves just arrived from Africa threw themselves into the sea and drowned, rather than live in servitude. This sad story gave rise to the slave narrative of the flying Negro, which is grounded in the respect American slaves had for native-born Africans and involves a group of Igbo people flying back to Africa from a slave ship. But Rabbi Fournier situates the story in a different tradition. He wrote, I was involved to speak, and I could only compare what I was witnessing to a true awakening of Igbo people to their Hebraic cultural roots. As I thought about why we were in St. Thomas Island, Georgia, my mind returned to an episode in Jewish history concerning the Jews of Masada, who cast themselves from the walls of their fortress rather than come under the control of the Roman Empire. I was inspired by the history of 13 Igbo men who were led by a chief of the Igbo nation to revolt and become martyrs rather than slaves. So he was making a comparative analysis between the two. All right, so we're at the bottom paragraph, page 85. It says, on the same occasions, American Igbo community leaders presented papers on the history of the Igbo and the ancient Hebrews, stressing shared customs such as circumcision, abstention from pork and shellfish, the Sabbath, and even observation of a fast day allegedly known by the Igbo as Yom Kippur. Another of the speakers representing the high priest of Igbo land who were at Talit and a red kippah, represented as a normative garment for Igbo priests, gave a lecture on the current conditions of the Igbo people. Today, Funye is a rabbi and spiritual leader of the Beth Shalom B'nai Zakin Ethiopian Hebrew congregation in Chicago. He is also National Associate Director of Bichol Lashon in every tongue, an American organization that is devoted to the pluralism in Judaism, rabbi of a Pan-African Jewish Alliance, and director of Nigeria Orthodox Sabbath Solidarity, NOS, which is headquartered in Asquiti, Nigeria. His current activities represent a meeting place for the two main legitimizing factors in the historical worldview of African American Jews, East Africa and Ethiopia. The ties that bind Igbo and other Black Jewish communities worldwide grow stronger all the time. In October 2011, another meeting between Igbo and other groups were described as follows: an incredible show of unity and solidarity. Hebrew congregation in America and Israel have called on the Igbo to return to their Hebraic roots, making the appeal at the second Igbo landing dedication and conference held in Charleston, South Carolina. Leaders and the representatives of the religious groups who made the trip in the company of their wives and children said that the survival of the Igbo nation depended on the immediate return to their covenant-based Hebrew cultural heritage. Moray Elisha Yisrael, who is the leader of the House of Israel, Cincinnati, Ohio, came to South Carolina because we are part of the Igbo people. We are one and the same. Teach and honor our ancestors. According to Moray Herman Taylor of the Shalom Congregation House of Israel, Jackson, Mississippi, the Igbo landing activities afforded him and his family the opportunity to bond with my brothers who are members of the House of Israel and have gone through horrible experiences in Nigeria in the last 40 years. Nasik Daniel, a delegate sent by Ben Ami, the anointed spiritual leader of the Kingdom of Yahweh, House of Israel, the Mona Israel, delivered a powerful message from his boss, reaffirming his support for the Igbo people. It declared that Ben Ami is with the Igbo people and bemoaned the tragedy that has befallen them. You are suffering in Nigeria, he said, because you have broken away from the covenant. Do not let anyone legitimize you. Legitimize yourself. The spiritual leader invited Indigbo to come to Israel next year so that we can reason together. Charleston, South Carolina was selected as a venue for this year's event because most Igbo captives passed through its ports before being sold into slavery. These dramatic instances of internalization of legitimating topos of indigenous Jews in West Africa has strong parallels in Africa too. And that is chapter 6 completed. So you guys pretty much got a crash course on the history of the rise of Black Jews in America. We learned about Crowdy, William Christian. It touched on Marcus Garvey. We learned about the charlatan La Bargola and various other people. Fournier, you can actually see him now on YouTube. He did an interview on Kulano's channel. All right, so that's chapter 6. It's in the history books, man. This will be archived and put on a playlist. So if anybody want to go through the entirety of the book, our overview and review of the book, you can on the Source Debate League or Genesis 49ers. All right. Next week we will be doing chapter 7, Divine Geography and Israelite Identities. That will be the next chapter that will be covered. Not next week, tomorrow. That will come out tomorrow. Chapter 7, and Wednesday, chapter 8 will come out. And then Thursday will be chapter 9 in the epilogue. That will be the finale, and we'll wrap this book up. And then we'll finish Edith Bruder's book. So I hope y'all got something and gleaned something from this this chapter. And I hope y'all get something from the entirety of the book. Y'all know how we rock it, man. How y'all want to close it out, man? How y'all want to close it out? Hit that like button, subscribe. You ain't gonna find no other YouTube channel that's actually going through the books in question. You're not gonna find it. You're not gonna find it, man. But we're gonna close out right. I appreciate everybody that watches us every day. We will be back tomorrow with chapter 7. We will be back tomorrow with chapter 7. Leave a comment, like, and subscribe. Source Gang, let's go. Let's get it. We're gonna end it right. We're gonna end it with LV Europa. You know what I'm saying? Showing love to the young gun. Let's go.
Yeah. LV Europa. Yo. I got a visa, that's one swipe. The change of demeanor, I got that almighty baby. That bitch came with a beeper, cold as a freezer. Free heat up in my leisure. I feel like a fever, baby. You know I'm a keeper, I got a visa, that's one swipe. The change of demeanor, I got that almighty baby. That bitch came with a beeper, cold as a freezer. Free heat up in my leisure. I feel like a fever, baby. You should know that I'm a keeper. Jesus keep saying, hey, and you can keep that tucked away. Some gon' come with the lies. Remember them when you pray. Some gon' cry when they die. You don't worry about the cave. Look, I done went through away my time and show, so I'm living today. That shit was real. I had to tell them slaves. But you gotta be brave. It's a land of the free. Gotta move like waves. Hey, put the ring to the path. I give them path for the rage. Then I put them on the path to take them all up the stage. I got a visa, that's one swipe. The change of demeanor, I got that almighty baby. That bitch came with a beeper, cold as a freezer. Free heat up in my leisure. I feel like a fever, baby. You know I'm a keeper, I got a visa, that's one swipe. The change of demeanor, I got that almighty baby. That bitch came with a beeper, cold as a freezer. Free heat up in my leisure. I feel like a fever, baby. You should know that I'm a keeper. This is a keepsake, hey. You can use this right away. Some gon' come with the truth. Honor them when you pray. Some gon' laugh about their life. They don't worry about the lays. Look, I done whipped up away that leather's real. When you can use it today, don't worry about how you're gonna get paid. Lord, give it free, take it away, hey. Don't you wanna be free? Remove that rage. There's a path to the light, don't misuse those ways. We flow with the truth. Gotta move like waves. I got a visa, that's one swipe. The change of demeanor, I got that almighty baby. That bitch came with a beeper, cold as a freezer. Free heat up in my leisure. I feel like a fever, baby. You know I'm a keeper, I got a visa, that's one swipe. The change of demeanor, I got that almighty baby. That bitch came with a beeper, cold as a freezer. Free heat up in my leisure. I feel like a fever, baby. You should know that I'm a keeper.
All right, man. Y'all stay tuned, man. Stay tuned in. I will be back tomorrow, and we will be dealing with chapter 7, which is divine geography, Israelite identities. That's the next chapter. So if y'all been following this long, you don't want to miss the next chapter, man. And it's only 2 chapters after that in the epilogue, and this book is in the it's gonna be in the archives, man. It's gonna be in the archives. Anybody question y'all on the book, you can just always refer to any of our videos and see a quick overview on it, and learn the book. You know what I'm saying? And it's a great book, awesome book. Like I said, Tudor Parfitt is a very objective scholar. He gives pros, cons, and caveats. It's just not one-sided. So that's how you have to read his work. I also will be sometime this week discussing Levant in Africa as well. And also it's very interesting that we brought up the presence of these Jews and these Jews being black. There has been plenty African specimens being found and discovered in the Levant. So that will be discussed in my video and my dissertation on the relationship of the Levant and Egypt. So y'all don't want to miss that as well. So we got information over here. We deal with information over here. We not them dilettantes like Dagger Frauds, Team Osiris, Amaraswad. They faking the fraud. They perpetrating a fraud. And what we're doing over here is actually disseminating information and pushing education on our people. Let's get it. You know how I'm rocking, man. Source gang, 7 gang over everything. Gang.